Whenever you're ready. So I'm just going to say that it's July 1st, 2022. We're in Hamburg, Louisiana, and this is Natalie Roeblant, and I'm interviewing Miss Peggy Laborde. So we were talking a little bit about what we were going to talk about before. So yeah, I guess, what we're trying to do is just kind of learn more about the Bayou de Glaise kind of community, which is, a bunch of little small communities. So, since you are a lifelong resident of the area, I wanted to talk to you. So if you just want to start by telling us kind of a little bit about yourself, your family background, kind of, who your parents were and what they did, that would be great.
I was the daughter of Jenny and Walker Nolan. My father was from Missouri. Mother's family was moved here from East Feliciana Parish. And I spent all of my lifetime here except for years that I was away at school.
How did they decide to land in Hamburg, your parents?
My father's sister was sick and probably had tuberculosis, and they moved to a warmer climate than Missouri. So, and Mother's family had migrated over from East Feliciana with other family members.
That's all right.
Call from Karen Shirley.
I can cut it out later. It's not a big deal. It's all right.
Call from Karen Shirley.
It's okay.
Call from Karen Shirley.
Cameron Shirley.
Call from Karen Shirley.
You want me to go get it? That's okay.
Pick up this on the phone.
That's all right. You want me to go get it?
Call from
No,
Karen
okay.
Shirley.
I thought this one was working. Sorry.
That's all right. We aren't too far. It's not a big deal. I can always make it work. It's not a big deal. That's what the little programs are for. But okay, so so you mentioned they wanted to move to a warmer climate.
Yes.
Yeah. And your father got into farming once they moved down here?
He had worked in a nursery in Missouri, and he liked outdoors, and they bought this plantation. And so for a short while, my grandfather was here also. But then after my grandmother and my aunt passed away, which was not too long after they moved here, my grandfather returned to Missouri, and Dad stayed.
What plantation was that they purchased?
It was Pavy.
Okay.
Plantation, I think.
Okay. What do you think, or did your dad ever talk about what the adjustment was like from Missouri to Hamburg?
Well, he never really did. Shortly after they moved here, and it was World War I, and he was off to France. So I guess my grandfather was here during the interim period, but Dad just came back after the war and met Mother, and they were married in 1920.
1920. And so what year and kind of what year do you remember, or how old were you whenever you got really involved in like the family farm? Or
well, you just growing up on a farm, you just kind of you're out seeing what's going on as a child, and I was a daddy's girl, so I was following Dad around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time we had lots of employees because they were still using mules to do everything. When they made hay, the baler was in a permanent position, and the mule-drawn hay rakes brought the hay to the baler. And we had old trucks and old, very old tractors then to run this. The tractors we used to run the baler.
Mm-hmm. What crops were your family doing most at that time?
Well, they had cotton, and right here where my house is was a cotton field before we built. And then, you know, it was during the Depression. I didn't ever realize it was a depression because we always had plenty of food, and Mother shared it with the people on the place and raised acres of vegetables and things like that. And of course, everyone had chickens and pigs, and they made it all right. There was not a lot of money exchanged, but they did barter things with neighbors, and
right.
That is how they made it through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of people say from the area that the Depression, they remember it, but it didn't affect them the way that it did in the other parts of the country.
You know, of course, the banks closing, you know, affected mainly the plantation owners, and but they all survived.
Mm-hmm.
They shared. Community was close, and they shared whatever produce they had.
Yeah, I actually was going to ask a little bit about the community. So since we're kind of talking about that, I guess tell us a little bit about kind of what the community was like in Hamburg when you were growing up, and kind of the role that that farming and your family had in the community.
Well, yeah, at the time, through the first years, there were 3 grocery stores in Hamburg. There was also a furniture store. There was I think it was a Case tractor agency, but they're right here on the corner. And also a little later on, there was a filling station with they did a little mechanic work there also.
Mm-hmm.
All in this little community.
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. I know it, and people say that all the time who were around maybe decades ago, and yeah, it's hard to imagine that there was more than just a couple of houses out here. Were there like any? What would you consider like the gathering places, or the places where maybe young people or even your parents would have gathered in the community? Was there anything like that?
No, not really. But they did visit around, and in the afternoons, the ladies would sometimes visit, and they always had handwork. They did a lot of embroidery and crocheting, and not so much knitting in this area, but some people did knit also. And that they spent their hours busy
working. Yeah. There was always something to be done, it sounds like.
And they were always preserving all of the vegetables that came in. They jarred those for the wintertime.
Mm-hmm. What did y'all had a big vegetable garden growing up, and
oh yes.
What kind of things did y'all grow?
Well, okra, tomatoes, snap beans, lima beans, black-eyed peas, white beans, eggplants. Mainly, though I assume that the beans were the major thing, along with the tomatoes that they canned.
And when you think about like the different things that you grew growing up and you ate growing up, are there any certain foods that really just kind of remind you of like your childhood, or that really bring back memories, or any specific dishes that maybe your mom would make, or someone else?
Not anything special, but we ate lots of vegetables, and they didn't ask, what do you want for lunch? Whatever was cooked, which usually was 2 or 3 vegetables and a small amount of meat, you ate what was there, and no questions asked about that.
And who did most of like the garden work? Was that something that your mom did, or was that more, kind of?
Mother always worked in the yard with yard men, and she had 2 men that worked with her because she loved flowers, and she had great flower gardens, and also she had maybe an acre or so of garden, vegetable garden, and of course she had had a lot of fruit trees also, pears and peaches and plums and figs, and I'm still enjoying the fig trees that have survived.
Yep, should be hopefully sooner than later. They'll be ready. Did y'all have like livestock, lots of chickens and?
We had chickens and cattle. Dad raised Hereford cattle with red with a white face, and they were the popular breed in this area at that time.
And was livestock more so for, because you mentioned the tenant buildings that y'all had on the property and that sort of thing, was livestock more so for kind of sustaining the farm, or was that was that more of an income?
It was a commercial herd.
Okay.
And of course we always had our own meat. And that's where the boucherie things came along in this area, because if you didn't have a storage place, the Iceman came along, and Mr. Shotland came with his ice truck every couple days, and there were very few refrigerators, so you shared with the people around, and they shared when they killed an animal also.
Right, you had to use it or it would go to waste, and
that's right.
And you could not do that, right? Not an option. And so, kind of just going back to kind of the community and what it was like growing up here. Do you have any kind of favorite memories of just life? Specifically, like in Hamburg and just within this community, or?
Well, everyone was happy in those days. The African Americans got together and they sang, and you could hear them singing at night together, and they have beautiful voices. And everyone just really worked together, and they were happy. You don't hear too many people today just singing and singing as they worked, and we had both white and African Americans living in the 12 tenant houses.
And those were families that were part of the farm. They worked on the farm. Yeah, that's nice to hear. So the bayou at one point was obviously a very big part of the community, and that has changed over time, obviously. Growing up, was Bayou de Glaise, what role did it play, would you say, in the community? Was it still functioning, or was it?
No, it really wasn't. Not during my grandparents' day, it was a way of communicating. But by the time I came along, it was no longer really navigable. So it was a fishing place, mainly. People fished a lot to have something to eat.
Was it an area that y'all, as children, would like go play in or fish in? Or?
No, it was always deep.
Yep.
We went fishing.
Mhm.
My dad used to take me fishing a lot, but there was no swimming in it or anything in those days.
Mhm. Yeah, now it's so shallow. It's interesting to hear. Yeah, it was too deep and now it's too shallow. um, so growing up on the farm, so obviously you kind of just like you said you when you're raised on a farm you just become it just is part of who you are. Did you have a favorite job or what was your first job on the farm that you can remember?
I remember picking cotton, but being very lazy as probably a 5 or 6 year old. I sometimes would get on the cotton sack. They had these very long 6-8 foot socket as cotton bags that they put the cotton in when they hand picked it. And I can remember sitting on the end of the sack sometime when I got tired of being out there.
It was probably a lot of work. When you said you were 5 or 6 years old, I mean, yeah, that's probably was very normal for 5 and 6 year olds to be out doing something,
sure.
Any job.
Everyone was outside,
Mm-hmm.
most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, did you when you were little? Was it kind of sun up to sundown outside?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Whether you were working or playing,
yes.
or
and the bear and the Kukyans and Beardons had a bell that they rang that we could hear when it was time to start and when it was lunchtime and when it's time to go back to work and at the end of the day.
Yeah. So it was kind of the universal.
You could hear it all over this community.
Mm-hmm. And just kind of thinking about kind of traditions and different community traditions. Were there any? I'm always curious about this, so I'll ask. Were there any like let's see, like not superstitions, but any particular like farming or planting traditions that y'all stuck to or that were particular to your family? So for example, they say not to plant on Good Friday. Is there anything else like that you remember that was kind of a
not really.
Mm-hmm.
My parents didn't go with that.
Yeah.
Of course there was a treateur that if your dog got a snake bite, you went to him to treat your dog, and he lived across the bay.
Really?
Over here.
What was his name? If you remember.
Let's see. Right now I can't remember his name, but
did he only treat animals or did he treat?
I guess he treated people too. I really don't know, but I remember one story about him being waked up during the night, to treat the dog. I guess he was telling us the next day because he did talk around to the other employees.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he was the only one? Was he the only one around here that was the only traitor around here?
As I knew, he was the only one.
That's funny. That's what I was just asking about was the tradition. So, you grew up on the farm, and then obviously you mentioned earlier you left to go to LSU. So, kind of how was that transition leaving to go to school in Baton Rouge for you?
I was very naive and knew very much. Didn't know very much about city ways and all, but made it through fine. I actually finished LSU in 3.5 years, and then went to Madison, Wisconsin, to the University of Wisconsin to pursue at the time I thought my master's degree. And I met Lucian prior to that, and we were very much in love. So I ended up not finishing the last 6 hours of my master's degree. I came home.
And what was Mr. Lucian doing in Wisconsin?
Well, he was here. He had come back from World War II.
You met him before you went.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
And he begged me not to go back, so I didn't. But I did work after I came back here. I taught veterans on the farm training program.
Okay, was that I'm sorry,
about 2.5 years.
Was that a federal program that you did that?
Yes.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, these men came back and they really wanted to be at home, and so they came back and you taught classes in the high school at night. About once a week, you had like 2 to 4 hours of class with them, and then you visited their farmland with them and tried to help them with fertilizer amounts and different varieties of things to plant, and just help them get started in the farming.
Like a transition from
Yes.
post-war to kind of back at home life.
Yes.
And that's what your background was in, right? You graduated in agronomy. So I guess tell me a little bit about what it was like to be the first woman in that program, trailblazer.
Well, there were a lot of men, of course, and I was the only girl there, and the dean was very nice to me. He had some experiment plots here on my father's farm, and so I knew him well. And when something came up that I would have a little trouble with, or a class that I didn't necessarily want to take, he was very generous and signed a release on things. So I ended up with 3 minors and not a lot of the subjects that the university really suggested you take.
You made your own courses, your own path. And was that something that you always knew you wanted to pursue, or?
Well, I was an only child, and I thought maybe I would have to take over the plantation, and I loved being outside and doing things on the farm, so that gave me the incentive to take agronomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, obviously it worked out. So when Mr. Lucian came back to Hamburg together, how did you kind of balance the job of being, a mom, which is a job, and then also kind of helping with the farm?
Well, actually, once my family was on the way, I resigned. And I was a stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, I didn't have to use my agronomy education too much. It became a family deal.
But I mean, you did also.
We did breeding of different clovers, the white clover and the red clover. Dad had started it, and Lucian got into it. Actually, Lucian came back from the war and wanted to stay in Navarro's Parish. So my dad had a feed mill, and his brother C.E. knew about it, and Dad was only using it when he needed to feed his cattle. But so Lucian and Dad formed a partnership, And that's how I met him, was in my father's office. I happened to be home from LSU and was typing up some stuff from Dad, and Lucian's father brought him in to introduce him to Dad. And that I met him at that time.
And that's how, is that how Hamburg Meals came to be?
That's how it came to be.
Okay, interesting. I didn't realize that.
He sold commercial feed for a while and raised pigs at Cheneyville. And every time he'd sell pigs, he'd buy cattle.
One for the other.
You know, pigs can got you into the farming business quicker.
Right. And I mean, I know you mentioned you're a stay-at-home mom, but obviously, you know, when your family is in farming, it can be very stressful because you're reliant on the environment around you. So, you know, what was that like kind of year to year, kind of being the...
Well, during harvest season, I'd feed like 20 some odd men. At that time, if you had you had a guy on the tractor, you had two guys on the harvester that the tractor was pulling, and then maybe one unchoking it when they went too fast and the grass got all up in it, and the machine would choke down. But we'd feed men in rotation. The equipment never stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And I did this for many years during harvest season for white clover, which is what we were raising. And we stayed in that business until the fire ants came along. And then there was no way to get that dirt out, even with, you had machinery with velvet rollers that could take out the dodder, which is a noxious weed. And we had the gravity machines that separated the light seed from other trash. But of course, they went through the recleaners first to take out the main trash and all. But with the fire ant dirt, there was no way to separate it to where it was saleable.
Where did the fire ants, sounds like it was like all of a sudden probably, where did the fire ants come from?
Well, they originally came in on ships.
Okay.
From other areas,
Mm-hmm.
and they spread very rapidly. And it was just, it put us out of the business. And my husband never had row crops. It was all cattle and pasture, you know, with the clovers,
Mm-hmm.
the red clover and the white clover. So it had to make a change in the way things were run after that.
Mm-hmm. So that's when he shifted to more row crops.
Yes.
Okay. And what did I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll let you explain. What did Mr. Lucian start planting whenever he did switch?
Well, actually, beans and corn and milo
Mm-hmm.
were the main crops that planted. And by that time, Reuben and my son-in-law and Tommy, my son, had come back and were farming, and gradually turned everything over to them.
Gotcha. Yeah, I didn't realize that. So clearly you've seen a lot of things change over the years. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask now that I remember, to backtrack a little bit. When you said you were cooking for 20 men during harvest season, what did y'all cook most of the time?
Well, I started out making big stews and rice and all, and then that got to be too time consuming for the men to eat, and so then we went to sandwiches, which was, we'd cook, of course we were killing our own cattle. We'd make great big roast, and I would make roast beef sandwiches or ham sandwiches and hot hamburgers, sometimes a hot dog if I was very busy. I mean, they had several of, and a knee-high pop great big bottles, and I lifted those cases of pops and worked them around. Their favorite was orange.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So kind of shifting a little bit back to when you were growing up, I'm gonna ask a little bit more about farming before I move on to the other stuff. But what did you feel was the most what was your favorite job or the most rewarding thing about the process?
I can't really say that I had a favorite thing. I was just always around, and I was we didn't have cell phones or radios at that time, and I was the person that when someone was needed went to get them or find them in all directions. Did a lot of running to the tractor agencies for parts, and that time the farmers could repair their own tractors. It wasn't like it is now where you have to have all these instruments to know what's wrong with them and fix them, to where you have to have a dealer come out and to fix your tractor. Mm-hmm. They could do it themselves. The tractors was simpler.
Mm-hmm. That kind of actually leads to my next question, which is kind of a twofold. So I guess obviously there's been lots of changes. So, more general question, what do you think, or what have been the biggest changes that you've seen in the farming industry over the last few decades?
Well, they were using mules to plow the cotton fields and other fields. And now you can sit, they tell me recently, you can sit in your house and direct that tractor to do the work in your field with no person aboard. Now, I assume that this is possible in the Midwest, whether you have flat land for miles at a time. It's very hard along the bayou with smaller plots and all to be able to do something like that. But now they can direct them in the field, but then and kind of watch them, or they have somebody maybe on board just sitting there while the tractor is directed to do whatever. But it's just unbelievable when I think of I can see Mr. U.O. Bordelon. He was the last one to have a mule to plow, and his place is adjacent to ours in the old road to Moorville.
Okay.
And I can see him with that mule and his plow plowing that land.
The mule was not driving itself.
No.
And then do you think there's obviously there's pros and cons to advancements, obviously, in technology. What do you think has been the biggest pro of the changes?
Well, it's gotten to where you need less men. They used to have maybe 20 some odd men working, and now they're down to 2, 3, 4, depending on the season. But the machinery is extremely expensive that you have to use.
Right.
And you're at the mercy of the weather. And also you can't sell your products at your price. You have to take whatever the market is for your farm products.
Right. Right, which also affects kind of how the role that farmers have in the community. I mean, that's changed a lot too, whereas you used to be, I'm assuming, when you were growing up, yes, it was more kind of providing for more of your immediate communities, whereas now it's, we don't really ever see the things that our local farmers produce for the most part. So, you've probably seen kind of how the farmers' roles in the communities have changed.
Yes, I helped buy many loads of corn when Lucian was in the commercial feed business. They would come in with horse-drawn wagons full of corn, and we'd weigh them, and it was $1.00 was what we for years that they got for that, and of course the yields were not, but about half of what they are now with modern fertilizer and everything. The corn yields are almost as good as the Midwest, which is unheard of in those days, that the yields would be as good.
Right. Yeah, right. They're able to produce just astronomically more than they were able to before. And then, obviously farming is not like a typical job. We all know that. So what do you think are kind of the biggest misconceptions that people may have about farming families and their roles and kind of their day-to-day life?
It's kind of hard to say what some of your city folks think about farmers.
Yeah, I mean, it varies, to be honest.
Yes. You have to love it to be a farmer. Mm-hmm. You really do. And I can remember when they were harvesting clover, and the combine would get choked up, and they'd have to get up under the combine to unchoke it, and all that. You couldn't see anything but the white of their eyes. They were covered in dust, and it was. But the people that were doing it loved it, and they wanted to be where they were. Mm-hmm. Though Lucian had many opportunities to be away from the farm, but after landing on D-Day on Omaha Beach, he was interested in staying home and enjoying a more leisure life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a slower pace of life. Well, he was very busy, but the community was slower, right? So let's see, since we are kind of talking about the community, I know that you don't speak French, but it was obviously a big part of the community in general.
Yes.
So if you want to tell me a little bit about kind of like what role French might have played in your life growing up, or if anybody you grew up with did speak it.
Well, my father and mother didn't speak French, though I assume Dad learned to, though he didn't ever try to speak it. I think he understood quite a bit. And I at one time tried to speak French, but my tongue just didn't twist to say the words properly. But I did understand enough that I knew what was going on. And there were a few people still around that didn't speak English. But then they got to where they would not let the children speak French on the school grounds.
Right.
And in retrospect, that was not a good thing. But then some of the children didn't know how to speak English when they came to school, which made it difficult in classroom studies.
Sure. Was that enforced when you were in school?
Yes, it was.
So
just about the time I went to school.
Right. It was when they made the switch.
They made that.
Okay.
Ruling.
So so like, for example, the families that worked on the farm, the tenant farmers, did their families speak French?
Most of the white men all spoke French, and actually the Bruyette family lived on there was, the grandfather, the father, and some children, their children that lived in these houses, especially on the curve here. They were all related. Might be a nephew or something, but I would say like maybe half of the tenant houses were from that family, related to that family.
Right. And then kind of going to school, you mentioned this briefly, but I mean, I would imagine it was a very difficult thing for the students who spoke French as their first language to be kind of, I mean, ultimately punished for speaking it in the classroom. That's hard to imagine. But I just wanted to ask because, like, it's a big part of kind of this area, so I was curious kind of what it was like whenever you were growing up.
Not too many people really speak French. My son-in-law Reuben can speak very. He understands and does speak some French, but not too well. But his family was had a French background,
right?
In their community,
right? He may have his parents maybe even only spoke French in the home potentially, or partially maybe.
Mostly, I think they spoke French.
I was just looking at my notes. So we touched a little bit about fishing, but we didn't really talk too much about kind of. I mean, I know you mentioned that you would go fish with your dad sometimes, and people would fish around here to catch fish to eat. And then obviously hunting and fishing has turned more into like a pastime versus a mode of survival. Was hunting something? Did y'all hunt a lot growing up? Was that something that your dad did, or?
My dad hunted quail and ducks until he fell in the Atchafalaya River. When I was too young to know about that, but he fell 2 boats. He was moving from one boat to the other, and I guess them boats moved, and he fell in with hip boots on and all. And of course, the river wasn't as big as it is now by a long shot, but he never went duck hunting after that. But he did like to quail and dove hunt. And I used to hunt squirrel and dove.
So deer hunting wasn't really a thing back then.
We never did hunt deer, and I've never really seen a lot. Although people that are out early and late do see the deer, they're still here.
Yeah, and it sounds like it was more of kind of getting extra food more so than a pastime.
Yes, it was. People were hungry,
right?
and they used to from the bridge when the water was high, they would gig garfish, and these were big garfish. I can remember them as being like 6 inches in diameter. They were a lot in the bayous at that time. And the men would stand there for hours, and when they'd come up, they'd gig them.
Yeah, and you hear a lot about the gigging and then the hoop net fishing too. And the Atchafalaya was a big thing as well.
Simsport really exported a lot of fish, and I can remember going to Mr. Murphy LeCour's ice house with my grandfather, and of course, it was the only place that had electric cooled things, but the walls in that ice house had this frost on them. And of course, the men would give me these fish tasting ice things of ice from the wall. And it was supposed to be it was a nice thing for them to do. They gave me a snowball.
But it tasted like fish.
And and it would taste like fish, but I was very happy to.
The thought that counts.
And I was probably very young at the time.
So speaking of going to Simsport, I was actually going to ask, that was one of my next questions. So, obviously each community used to be kind of a little bit more self-sustainable than they are now. But when y'all would go for, like, let's say, any necessities that you may have needed, what was like the big city, or where would y'all travel to go get different things?
Well, Alexandria, of course, was the closest city that we went to, but we went there mostly for clothes and things like that, and maybe a few odd things, but everything else was, the stores had shampoo and things like that you needed, that were local, and people just bought local, and if they needed any vegetables and stuff like that, they had to grow them or barter with their neighbor. And during the Depression, they started raising just for trying to make a little extra money on the farm. Like they tried cabbages, they tried watermelons, they tried sweet potatoes. They got huge in this fertile soil and were not very sweet. They always said you need a slope on a poor land to make a sweet potato, a real sweet potato. And let's see, they tried tomatoes. And then, of course, at one time they shipped a lot of shallots from here.
Really?
But every time things would get kind of going well, then some other place like California would jump in, and their produce would come out like the week before, and the price would drop.
And they were probably able to produce way more too.
Yes. So gradually there was a shallot shed here and one in Moorville. Then they shipped out. We had a spur here of the railroad, and they put a rail car right at our warehouse doors, and you could load in. We shipped a lot of seed to different places by rail. Until the train careened into the warehouse, and
went into y'all's warehouse.
We've had 3 rail accidents right here by our field road.
Really?
Those cars are all under.
Really?
They just buried them.
I didn't know that. I knew one had wrecked in front of in front of my parents' house, but I didn't know.
Yeah.
Here, you too.
Right. It's in this gentle curve.
Probably Michelle.
That it's going over now. That the rails are.
How's it going?
They eventually they took those spurs off, and there's no sidetrack here anymore.
I didn't realize that had happened.
Yes,
I mean, obviously,
and then they used to have the TP railroad that came in from Bunkie. It came through Long Bridge, Moorville, here to Simsport, and then it would back up, and there was a rail into Marksville, and it had to back up from there to around Mansoura, and because there was no turntable turn them around.
It's an inconvenience.
Yeah.
So growing up, I'm glad you mentioned the railroad. Growing up, was the railroad strictly just for commerce, or were people still using it to travel?
Oh, they used it to travel. Trains ran to New Orleans early in the morning and returned going north in the late afternoon. So you could make a trip to either Baton Rouge or New Orleans. And well, I went back to LSU many times. You just have to flag the train here. If the agent would put a flag out and the train would stop, pick up passengers, and then eventually they didn't stop on a flag, they stopped at Mansour.
Right, so you had to get there first.
And we had to go to Mansour to catch the train, but you could make a day trip.
So you used to be able just to catch it right in front of the house?
Yeah, right at the depot, which is at the end of your father's and mother's pasture there by the house.
I didn't realize that's where the depot was.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, I just want to ask while I'm here, I didn't have it in my list of questions, but I wanted to ask about this house. Just if you wanted to tell me a little bit about the history behind this house, and the year y'all built it, and kind of the...
Well, we started looking around about the time that Lucian's clothes got in the broom closet when we had 4 kids. And we looked around till every house that we liked in Baton Rouge, which is the main place that we would ride around and look at houses. A. Hayes Town had built the house. So eventually we got Mr. Town to draw up some plans, and he was a very well-known architect, and he came and supervised the building of the house, and if something wasn't right, he'd tell them, tear it out. And that actually started in March of 65, and we moved in January the 27th of 66. Lucian went to a meeting in Alexandria, and I stopped his crew and my dad's crew and got the trucks, and I had everything boxed, and I had somebody in one house and somebody in the other, and as they brought it in, it was put in place. Everything was put in place, and I left a note on the door at the old house. We've gone home. Come join us. So everything was
ready to go.
It was ready to go.
Ready to go. Oh, well, I think that kind of covers everything I was going to ask you, but I'm going to take a look just to make sure I didn't miss anything. But if there's anything else that, came to mind while we were chatting that you wanted to share, just let me know.
I'll probably think of more things tomorrow.
I can come back another day. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'll turn it off soon, but let's see. I'll stop recording so I don't accidentally mess up myself. There we go. Yeah. And then I have this one too as backup.